So Mark and Nicole have been attending our church for about a year, maybe more than that. Time flies when you're having fun. They are members of our congregation, and they're here most of the time. Sometimes they have to travel, sometimes they have to work, but most importantly, they're brothers and sisters in the Lord. They're Christians. They're serving the Lord together, but they're also licensed psychotherapists. They're licensed counselors, and they have their own practice. In fact, you guys transitioned recently into your own private practice, right?
Correct.
Yes,
So,
yes, it was
you
wonderful.
Want to share about that for just a moment?
Yes, in March, just kind of give you a brief little background. I worked in addiction and mental health for 21 years, and I decided at my age that it was time to not work for anybody else except my wife. So we decided to go into private practice, and of course we started essentially right when COVID-19 was in its rare form, but we just prayed and believed that this is what the Lord wanted us to do, and it's been extremely rewarding. I'm trying to find the right word, but it's been the best thing we ever did. So.
Yes, and the Lord has blessed us with people, individuals that we can help, so we're grateful.
It's more than enough, trust me.
More than enough. Well, we're thankful that you not only are leaders in our community and you lead from a Christian perspective, but we're thankful that you're part of Cross Community, and I know they're grateful, and I just wanted to express my appreciation to you guys for being here tonight. So here's what we want to do tonight. We want to deal with handling fear and anxiety from a biblical perspective, from a professional perspective. And so we had asked a number of people to submit questions, and I have in my hands a number of statements and questions. And so we're going to look at all of these. And I want to say two things before we get started, and quickly I'm going to turn it over to them so they can answer questions. A couple things. We know scriptures tell us in the book of Joshua, for example, fear not. And we know that Paul says in Philippians 4, be anxious about nothing. How do we do that? How do we do that when our world is turned upside down, when the pandemic has changed everything in this life as we know it? How do we handle it when we're going through an appendectomy? How do we handle it when you're in the hospital? What do you do with all that? And we had some incredible questions that were presented to us by the youth and from the elementary, and a couple of them gave us permission to use their names. So what I'd like to do is start with that, and if we could work our way back. So Elijah, I don't know if Elijah is here tonight, but he shared a couple of things, and he said, I'm very excited to go back to school and see my friends and my teachers, but I'm very afraid because we haven't been in school for 6 months. And then he says this, and this year my class is going to be on the second floor, and I'm very scared if there's a fire. What do we do, and how do we get down the stairs? I read that because I think Elijah's question, though it is in the context of his school, I know a lot of grown-ups that are afraid because they haven't done something in about 6 months. So I guess we could begin with Elijah's question and ask the question, how would he approach that?
You want me to? Okay. First off, Elijah, thank you so much for the question. And I guess the best thing to recognize is that we all struggle in some way with anxiety, fear, stress as part of our human nature. And so how old is Elijah, roughly?
8.
8 years
Did
old.
I hear
okay.
8? Okay.
So,
Did I hear 9? Did I hear, no, 8 years, okay.
Elijah, are you out there somewhere? Elijah?
Hey, buddy.
Okay, there you
Thank
are.
you for
Thank
being
you.
willing
Okay.
to let us read your questions tonight.
Well, one of the things that we teach is about action, about doing things in a practical sense, and especially when it pertains to anxiety. And one of the things that we came up with today is should be a mandated thing for schools to practice these things. and to practice fire drills. And schools do this for one reason only. It's because of the fact that there must be some action taken to overcome the fear. Now, when you're 8 years old and you're dealing with fear, it's not so easy just to say, okay, I'll trust these people since I haven't been back in school in 6 months. But I can tell you that the difference between what Elijah's feeling and what the outcome is where the anxiety is, in that middle. And so we're hoping that the school that you go to will be repetitive in some way to kind of help you work through your fears by having multiple the fire drills, and helping you understand that the more, and whether it's Elijah or any of us, once again, what about in a practical sense? What are we doing in a practical sense to overcome the anxiety? Well, he's got help from the school, hopefully, that will help him work through this anxiety while he's at school. And another thing that Elijah, you could do in the morning, pray with your family before you go to school. Would be just incredible. And once again, the repetitiveness of that and the assurance of his parents to pray with him for that fear, it would be a good thing to do as well.
Dakota also gave us permission to use her name, and if you know Dakota, you know she's going to give us permission to use her name. Where are you at, Dakota? You're right down there on the front row. This is what Dakota said. I'm anxious about missing my family. I'm anxious about school changes. I'm scared of my family getting sick and from dying from COVID, and I'm worried about not being able to celebrate holidays in the same way. Those are some of her concerns as she is facing fear and anxiety with COVID.
I'll let you handle that one.
That's a lot. But, that, again, it's the fear of the unknown and change. So whenever we have change, certainly this pandemic has brought about enormous change in our life, being socially isolated. And what does that mean? That means we lose connection with ourselves sometimes and others. And that's where, Mark and I were talking about this morning, being able to, even though we have lost that connection, staying in the Word of God and praying to give us that strength to get through that. And that's one of the biggest things I think about, is how can we stay in that to help us discern, because sometimes when we're socially isolated, we get all in our heads and we start thinking and thinking and thinking. And again, that's part of the human condition. Our nature is, we know what our nature is. We have a sinful nature. And so being able to stay centered, and one of the things that helps keep us centered is that the Word of God, and being in prayer. And also fellowship. So we're lucky that we have this congregation where we can, even today, where we can sit here in this sanctuary and feel safe enough to talk about our fears, because there's a lot of people that have fears that don't have a place to go and to even voice the fact that they have a fear.
That's good. And Miss Dakota, thank you for asking these questions, and thank you for making those comments, because we all have fear of something in our life. Pastor Ron even has fears in his life. You could probably ask him about that sometime. We all have fears in our life. I think it was Phil, who is one of our elders. Phil, God bless you. Where are you at tonight? I thought I saw you right there. I think he said that fear is an acrostic for false expectations appearing real. Do I remember that correctly? And that's it. False what? False evidence appearing real. So we all have to deal with that. And that kind of brings me to somebody from the high school. They're anonymous. I don't have their names, obviously, but this is what they said. I found this interesting. I'm feeling super anxious to the point where I can't sleep at night and I can't eat during the day. I've tried changing my mindset and calming down and thinking thoughts of affirmation, and he said, or he or she said, but I couldn't release the stress thinking about hanging with my friends. He says, I'm forced to start school alone, online, which is really not the way that I learn. and I feel like I'm being trapped in my house. I think that's probably something I'm assuming that not only the youth are dealing with, but when COVID hit, man, I couldn't sit in my house very long at all. My personality does not permit that. And I couldn't imagine what it would be like as a kid being forced to stay at home. How might we cope with that a little bit?
The first thing I thought of when I read this was, what else is going on in this person's life? And I kind of like to look beyond what actually that I see here. And as I mentioned earlier too, I think that how these things get worked out is more in a practical sense. And one of the things that I like to teach about balance in life. And so if I had this individual as one of my patients, we would talk a lot about balance. We would talk about hobbies and recreational activities. We would talk about nutrition. We talk about family and other type relationships, and also talk about their faith in the Lord. And so creating this practical aspect about how to cope with the things that is outlined here really is about focusing on the things and the solutions to help overcome some of the fears that are here. You know, you talk about that, anxiety and having this anxiety. You know, if you ever played sports growing up, you know that those butterflies that come right before, tip off, or if you're a golfer in this audience here, if there's 4 or 5 guys sitting around the tee and you're teeing off, you're feeling it. And so it's a natural process once again to feel this, but how can I incorporate some things into my life and start focusing on the things that are more solution-driven to help me overcome some of these things. And then we can start looking at each one of these things and start working on them individually. Nicole?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I read this question, I loved it because I work with some teens in my practice, and this is exactly what almost every teen is saying to me. So again, normalizing it, they're feeling trapped, feeling isolated, and self-care, that's kind of what you're speaking of. What are the self-care things? And I look at self-care because we kind of throw that term around, and what does it mean? And I look at it, and from a biblical sense, self-care can be God's care. So what does God want from us? And what can we do to live that out? And of course, with teens, it does have to be a practical sense, and I think feeling anxiety, feeling trapped, or feeling isolated, looking at the things that can help them, which we often don't talk about, or I don't think we emphasize them enough in our life as being meaningful. So and those things I'm speaking of can be as simple as diet and exercise, and the tangible things I think that you said. What can you do? What is helping, and how can you add to that? But I really love that question because I think it's what people are struggling with, especially teens right now, feeling kind of trapped and isolated when they could easily be with their friends, and now that just kind of all stopped. So that's important. It's important to keep talking about.
I appreciate what you guys talk about with self-care, and as I'm listening to you, I'm not trained like you are, so I'm learning along with the congregation here. I'm processing this the best I can. So I hear the word self-care, and I'm thinking holistic, approaching this holistically. And since I am a parent of 5 and 3 still live at home, they're all teenagers, and there's responsibilities that are on my shoulders, and that's what I'm hearing through my ears and watching through my eyes is that, okay, they're telling us that in order to help these kids navigate these fears, which is real to them, just like our fear of whatever it may be is real to them, it's going to involve some pragmatic approaches such as exercise, such as diet, such as a safe environment. So what I'm hearing from that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm hearing saying, okay, I need to do, and I think this is applicable to all of us who are parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles and whomever you might know that you can influence. I think we need to help people to create and maintain a safe environment within this time of chaos, so that there can be some kind of navigating the fear, overcoming the fear. If your home is in turmoil, and if COVID didn't exist, well, no wonder your kids are anxious and worried and all of that. And in the midst of the COVID, I think we can be very practical, and I think parents need to help their kids eat right. I think parents need to help their kids exercise maybe, and stay off social media. And as much as that stuff can drive a grown person crazy. So that's what I'm hearing. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. And just last week, one of my patients, I was talking with my patients, and she has a 13-year-old and a 10-year-old, and they were driving home from, I'm not sure where, but she rolled down her window, and the 13-year-old literally lost his mind. Mom, we're going to get COVID. We're going to get COVID. Roll your window back up. And so kids are hearing, and young adults are hearing a lot of things out there, and social media is one of those where a lot of information is being shared. And so I think it's important that we kind of reel everything back in, and that education piece is an extremely important part of that self-care as well.
Thank you. That's good. That's good stuff, isn't it? Very practical. One of the other teens, and there again, we don't know who wrote this, but they basically said, hey, for me personally, I'm not afraid of my Zoom not working. I'm not afraid of COVID. I'm not afraid that my family will get sick, but there's something they said deep down that makes me afraid. And so I think they addressed this in their prior comments about how to help our teens to overcome and to cope with this, and it's by providing them with a safe environment. And I can tell you that I deal with fears, and the way that I deal with fears is I recognize them for what they are, and I put them in their proper place, and I try to maintain my diet. I try to maintain good exercise, and I try to create a safe environment for myself and staying away from crazy. I learned a new phrase the other day, by the way. That's so 2020. That's what I heard. Oh, that's so 2020. When you come across something that's crazy and makes no sense, oh, that's so 2020. Let's say it together. That is so 2020. But we're dealing with it nonetheless. Let me move into something that was given to us by the elementary kids. This is pretty cool here. I'm afraid to interact with others except on the computer. I have anxiety about understanding directions on the computer. I have fear of talking to people because I haven't talked to them in like forever. Say like forever. In like forever. And I'm sad because I may not be able to play tag with my buddies at school.
So anxiety, it can be kind of biochemical, and then it can be related to our emotions. It can be both, and at the same time. And so looking at, okay, what is going on in my emotional life? Like, what is going on internally in me? And for a child, that they need to have the guidance to kind of discern. And this speaks to like a kind of a larger problem that I see in our society. So it doesn't really answer the question for the child, but in our world, like we're bombarded, our world, like when we live in a world that kind of competes for our attention and is telling us things that are really in direct conflict to biblical teaching, that can be hard to discern for a child. It can be hard to discern for us as adults. And so when I think about that, that just naturally creates fear and anxiety. So again, being able to discern, and is certainly like an example of that would be the mainstream media, what we've been given from the mainstream media about this pandemic has, in my view, it's been misinformation on many levels that has created fear, like a different level of fear, not a natural fear, a fear that is kind of man-made. And we know, living kind of in the secular world, we live in it, we don't have to be of it, but it it can be difficult at times, and so we have to. So the question is, what's real and what's not, and so helping each other through that. And that, again, we were talking about this morning, just fellowship, and again, staying in the Word of God and prayer, and how that can give us strength to get through and to be able to really discern what's real.
Mm-hmm. I've been following this whole situation in California with John MacArthur and Grace Community Church, and everybody has opinions, and that's fine. We don't want to be divisive here tonight, not them but me, with what I'm about to say, but I tend to side with John MacArthur on a lot of what he's doing and saying out in California, because they're trying to say that the church is non-essential. So let's just close the church down because it's a non-essential entity, yet abortion clinics are considered essential, and liquor stores are considered essential. When I hear them talk about community and support systems, obviously the church can't become a surrogate parent for you, but we can be a family-centered, church-supported kind of a church where your kids, when they come, have a safe, godly, encouraging environment to come to, where they're receiving all of what you're saying needs to be received in the home and in the church. So I appreciate you emphasizing, because I've heard several times from both of you the word community. The Bible talks about it. Here are professional counselors telling us you cannot overcome this in isolation. You can't. It's just impossible. You have to have people around you. Someone wrote a tremendous question here. I've dealt with this some as a pastor in helping people navigate this. Basically, how do we treat mental health, depression, and anxiety using medications in a biblical or from a biblical perspective?
Wow. I've been asked that question for years, and it's a difficult one. There's a couple schools of thoughts on that, but I see it a little differently. I believe that because of who we are and our nature as human beings, we're going to suffer, and knowing that, I think it's important that God designs and people have purpose, and that's why I believe God gives us doctors and calls people to be therapists, and because I think it's important to be able to navigate through our world and what that really means. Now, when we think about medication management, this is kind of a difficult question to ask because of the fact that in our culture today, we believe that medication is the solution. But medication is just one component of what needs to be done when someone is on medication. The therapeutic process and the spiritual process have to occur along with the medication. And in our culture today, you're not going to get too many psychotherapists out there who are Christians, who believe in biblical principles and values. And so this makes it even a little tougher, a little more kind of harder to kind of navigate through our world. But make no mistake about it, people suffer from depression, and people suffer from anxiety, and people have post-traumatic stress disorder, and people do have bipolar. And I wish it wasn't that way, but because we live in a fallen world, we are subjected to suffering as well. And so anybody who takes medication, I strongly encourage you to seek out a good therapist as well and learn and develop coping skills to help manage your condition. And there's no shame in taking medication. But if it's done properly with the right professionals, along with the proper therapeutic process and the spiritual growth, I think you can overcome a lot of the symptoms that you do have. And I've seen it over and over and over again. It's a difficult, very difficult topic in the church, but I'm an advocate of getting help. And I've seen people who are not medicated and struggle out there. And, you know, right now, during this COVID pandemic, and a lot of you may not know, but suicide rate is going through the roof right now. And a lot of these people are struggling with depression related to COVID, not related to COVID. COVID compounds the situation as well. So, but my suggestion is to seek the good help that's out there available. And if you do have to take medication, make sure that you have a good psychiatrist or medical doctor who is attuned with the Bible as well, right? Can guide and direct you in the right way. So.
They hit on something that I think is very important. Nicole used the term biophysical, and you know, we're mind, body, and soul, and God made us that way. And because of what Mark said, we live in a fallen place, and so people do suffer from postpartum depression and PTSD, and the list could go on and on and on. Just yesterday, someone from the community asked me, what do I do for my family member? I said, you need to take them to a doctor. You might need to even Baker Act them because they were acting suicidal, and you need to make sure you have spiritual partnership in this process. So I didn't ask them to say this. I just wanted to interview them, but I am thankful that God has brought these kind of people into our church and to help all of us to navigate this, both body, mind, and soul. One of the young teenagers in our church, Lene, asked some just really great questions from a biblical perspective, and I'll just mention them and we can incorporate it together because I think this is driving home what you're talking about. She says, for example, in reference to false teaching, how do you deal with pastors that are not preaching the truth? Well, you kick them out of the church, you quit going to the church, you don't listen to them. That's the short answer. But wonderful, it's encouraging to me to know that there are young people in our church that are discerning enough to ask the question, what do you do when people are teaching false teachings? In order for her to know that, she's got to know what is true, and she does know what is true because she's been raised in a good home by godly parents, and she herself is a student of Scripture. And she says there is a pastor online that's telling everybody that homosexuality is okay and telling them that it is okay, that's a sin. And she's exactly right. And I think that's kind of what you were talking about in terms of media being a purveyor of so much of the chaos in our community and in our culture, always being bombarded with this kind of false narrative, whether it's a political false narrative or an ideological or a moral false narrative. And she said, you know, in the Old Testament, there might be commandments that are given to us. How do we differentiate what we listen to in the Old versus listening to in the New? I just want to say this to you, Lene, in a very general sense. And by the way, Melanie has asked me if I would come over and do a forum with the youth, and I'm looking forward to doing that and addressing these issues in a much more detailed manner. But all of God's Word is authoritative. Now, obviously, today we're not under the civil and the ceremonial laws in the Old Testament, but the moral law, the Ten Commandments, is as applicable today as it has ever been in the history of the world. So we can decipher what we need to discern out of the Old Testament and apply it to our lives. And then she mentioned this whole concept of scary movies and how demonic they can be in origin. And it would seem to me that with COVID isolating all of us, if we're not careful and we're opening ourselves up to a lot of stuff that Disney puts out that might seem elementary or innocent on the surface, but it's all about spirits and demonic activity, I think, Lene, you're right on the money. We need to avoid those kind of things. And it's just so encouraging to hear one of our young teens talk about the need to avoid that kind of stuff. So I guess that goes right back into what you're saying from a pragmatic perspective in the environment that we're creating. Just make sure those elements are present. Would that be right?
I just want to say one thing. You know, day in and day out, I see the spiritual warfare, and Nicole and I talk about this. But prayer, be in prayer, be diligent in your prayer life, and stay steadfast in the Word, and the fellowship is so vitally important. I mean, our world right now is so divided, and it's really, I think, all about rebellion against the Lord, and I see it played out day in and day out, and I just can't say enough about prayer, how important it is.
Yeah, and with that rebellion and denial of God. So I just want to say a comment about the comments and questions from Lene too, because I loved these things, and it was so great to hear. And the thing I think about with that, and Mark and I talk about it a lot, in our profession and in our world, our culture, our society, the abnormal has become the normal. Things have been normalized, like so many things. I could go on and on about what's been normalized that truly is abnormal when we look at it from a developmental perspective in psychology. So we could kind of spend another 2 hours on that, but I wanted to say that in regards to her question, because that's what's really happening right now with the world. It's been turned upside down on many levels, not just the pandemic, but what's going on politically and in our streets, and that also creates a sense of fear and are we safe? And so being able to recognize that again and to discern the normal from abnormal.
I'm going to ask them if they would tonight, if they would pray over this congregation, asking God to help us to not normalize the abnormalities of society, right? But to stick with His Word, to be rooted in it as Lene has so adequately articulated. And if you're here tonight and you suffer from any kind of depression, anxiety, any kind of mental illness, please get help. They would be available to help you, to help guide. We would be available to help guide you in total anonymity. But I can assure you, all of us deal with something. And we need help. We need to get that help, okay? Can we let Mark and Nicole know how much we appreciate them being here tonight?